Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the June Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on working remotely and potentially planning for a return to your office. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I am the CEO of Community IT, and I'm also the moderator for the webinar series, and I'm going to be a co-presenter of today's webinar. I'd like to take a moment to welcome my fellow co-presenters. Good afternoon, Johanny.
Good afternoon, Johan. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us. Johanny is our Chief Operating Officer, and I would also like to welcome Steve Longenecker. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Johan. Thanks for having me as well.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Steve's our Director of IT Consulting. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company, and our team of almost 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We are ourselves technology experts, and we have been year after year named a top 200 North America managed services provider by Channel Futures, and we were a 2019 winner in their global MSP 501. So thank you again for joining us today, and I'm going to go through the planned agenda for our webinar today. We are going to be talking about potential, we're going to try to cover all the situations. We know that some nonprofit organizations are in the process of returning to their offices in some form. We know that other nonprofits are continuing to work remotely. I think it's likely that most organizations will be working remotely on some level. So we're going to spend some time talking about best practices for working remotely as an organization. We're going to specifically focus on some of the cybersecurity issues that we've encountered over the last 3 months since the start of the pandemic. And cybersecurity is a real priority for us at Community IT, so we're going to spend a little bit of dedicated time on that. We'll talk about some good practices for cybersecurity, and then finally, we'll go through some tips for potentially reintegrating, going back to the office or moving into more of a hybrid remote and in-office work environment. So as we were planning, so we put the this webinar on our editorial calendar about 2 months ago. So if you think back to mid-April, it was really unclear at that time what was going to happen. I think there was great hope that the coronavirus pandemic would be more under control, and that cities and states would be in the process of reopening. Potentially, organizations would be going back to work, but we didn't know. And I think the uncertainty associated with the coronavirus is something that's making it challenging to plan. So it was challenging for us to plan the webinar, also challenging, of course, for all of you in terms of what you're going to be doing with your organizations now and for the rest of the year. So I think we decided intentionally when we scheduled this webinar that we were going to be flexible in terms of what we plan to cover, and that in fact that made sense because flexibility is something that's being asked of all of us these days in light of the changing situation with the coronavirus. And this graphic from NPR really highlights that. You can see the real sort of divergence in and this is from June 4th. And obviously the situation's changed. It's changing on a weekly basis, and in some cases on a daily basis for some of us. And you can see there's kind of a diversity in terms of the stay-at-home orders around the country. There's a diversity even within that in terms of what's allowed with regards to restaurants, with regards to hairdressers and barbers. For those of you who are here in the Washington metro region, you're probably aware that we have to navigate a variety of municipalities and states. Early on, Maryland, Virginia, and DC said they were going to work in a coordinated fashion. That lasted for a couple of weeks. Then it became clear they needed to make their own decisions. So we now have Maryland, Virginia, and the district all at different levels of reopening. And even within Maryland, for example, different counties are at different levels of reopening. So it's an evolving and complicated landscape, and just reinforces the point that we need to be flexible as we think about planning for the future. So let's talk a little bit about remote work challenges. And I think our assumption is that most organizations are going to continue to work remotely, either entirely or at least many of their staff will probably continue to work remotely for the foreseeable future. And so I think it's important to think about, now that we've all had 3 months of remote work behind us, we can talk a little bit about some of the specific challenges that we've faced, that our clients have faced, and that many nonprofit organizations are facing. So one of the challenges has to do with management, just overseeing staff. It makes checking in with people more difficult, particularly if you're an organization that's used to working out of a single office, and just being able to check in on people, find out how they're doing. A lot of the face-to-face interactions that support management and teamwork has become more difficult. Staff, just basic reporting to supervisors has become more challenging in a remote work environment. So that's one major area of challenge. Another is the security holes, and we'll get into this in a lot more detail, but working from home in some ways, particularly with regards to IT, creates new security vulnerabilities that maybe weren't there before. Specialized applications can be challenging to access, particularly if you had a specialized line of business application or software that you were using from your office. Providing staff with the access to that application now can be challenging. So, and the last one, I guess this is a challenge. Proactive planning pays off. It was very difficult for all of us to be proactive when it came to the coronavirus. Even for those organizations who were sort of ahead of the curve in terms of our response here in the United States, I don't think anyone came into 2020 on January 1st being prepared for what we've had to deal with over the last 3 months. So one of the challenges here is it's just been hard to be proactive with a situation that would have benefited from proactive attention. Steve, Johanny, anything you want to add?
This is it's obviously Steve. I have a different voice than Johanny. I would add a couple things to this slide or to this part of the presentation. Definitely some clients were more prepared for this than others, whether it was because of proactive planning or whether because I think a number of our clients were leveraging the cloud and thinking about remote work as a benefit to their staff a while ago. And it wasn't because they were preparing for COVID-19. It was because that was something that they wanted to do anyway. And those organizations were definitely in a better place when this started. The other thing that I think this slide, it's about remote work, so it's appropriate that it's not on this slide. But I think the bigger picture for our clients, which are nonprofits, is the tremendous financial uncertainty that this whole thing has created for our clients, and we're seeing it at Community IT in terms of just the complete freezing up of our project pipeline. Nobody really wants to. Everyone's unsure. Like, are we going to be able to do our fall fundraiser or not? If we can't, what does that do to our budget? Projects often have an on-site component. People aren't sure how to pull that off. There's just a lot of things that are beyond remote work that have really been challenging about the situation that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing I would add to that is that a big challenge was that people that were already in the cloud could actually make the transition easier, right, to working from home, or some people were already kind of working from home and in the office in some days. But for those who were not prepared, and that goes to proactive planning pays off for sure, then you have to scramble to kind of, find a way for them to connect remotely, maybe using their computers, their home computers. And so to put in some sort of policy in place, kind of on a fly there to allow for that, and maybe put some guardrails if you even did that. And so I think, kind of, that kind of create additional challenges as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the some of the things you can do to work around these challenges. And we're going to frame it in terms of some IT steps that you can take, and then we'll talk a little bit about how these things specifically address some of the challenges. So first and foremost, you can leverage the cloud. So I mean that sounds pretty obvious, but there's a lot of ways that you can. We don't mean use the cloud, and I think most organizations now are using the cloud. They've moved some or all, if not, maybe most of their information into various cloud platforms. And I think what a lot of people have found is that there's even more you can do in the cloud that maybe you weren't doing when you were working out of a central office. So we'll talk in a little bit more detail about some of the things that you can do to better leverage the cloud. Another recommendation we have is to decentralize your equipment. And so, if your equipment, primarily computers, are tied to a central location, so if you've been buying desktops for your staff and those are located at a central office, obviously, it's difficult to do something about that now, but as you think about the future, we strongly recommend getting laptops for everybody. They just tend to be more flexible. The price difference has really come down, and they just give you a lot more the ability to work in a decentralized manner. So moving forward, if you have the ability to decentralize equipment, that will definitely help with working remotely more effectively. Related to that, though, you want to have ways of centralizing the management of that equipment. And so at Community IT, we have a whole device management system that we use to manage all of the laptops and desktops and servers of our clients. And that enables us to ensure that they have effective antivirus, that it's blocking compromised access to compromised websites, that it's downloading and installing the latest patches, and we centrally manage that, and that runs, and we have visibility into that regardless of where the computer is located. As long as it's connected to the internet, we're able to manage those devices. So that's something that we also strongly recommend, that organizations, either themselves or with a partner, find a way to centrally manage the hardware. That's something that until recently, was often done within a central office location because of, kind of pre-cloud era, the way that Microsoft in particular set up server domains. All of that was, tied to having all the computers in a single location, and made them easier to manage that way. And the tools now exist to essentially manage hardware, from the cloud. And so in some ways, it's another way of leveraging the cloud, but it's definitely makes it easier to have staff working from a wide variety of locations. And then I think something we've all gotten familiar with and comfortable with, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail, using video and chat to stay in touch. And that's a way of really helping with sort of the management challenges, helping to overcome some of the barriers that are there when you're not physically in the same location with someone. Using chat as a way of just catching someone, using video as a way of checking in with people, can be an effective way of working around that challenge. Johanny, Steve,
Mhm.
anything to add here?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you outlined as challenge was kind of the management and reporting. And, when I think about kind of COVID-19, I feel like it created an opportunity for us to kind of experiment with remote work. Like I mentioned, we were kind of already, some of us were already kind of doing that at a certain extent, but we were pushed to the cliff to just figure it out. And I think as a result of that, managers uh, need to they needed to orient themselves to kind of leading remote teams, and that created some challenges in terms of managing staff remotely. And so some things that I would like to kind of share in terms of lessons learned for me managing kind of more people remotely. I think one thing that I found very helpful was kind of increase communication with the team, but not so much on kind of a regular check-in as we used to have in the office, but kind of have more check-ins, more frequent check-ins. And some of them kind of, informal, just to kind of hear how they're doing. So frequent conversations with staff have created kind of more staff engagement, at least on my experience. I think the other thing that has been very helpful was kind of providing clear expectations for the staff and help them prioritize also prioritize their job, because some people really like to work in the office, and they realize once they switch to remote that actually being in the office make them to stay on task. And so it was important for me to realize kind of each individual on a case by case and see kind of what were the need, and then kind of help them prioritize their work. And then the last thing I would say about that is that team huddles have been very, very helpful. And we used to have team huddles for certain teams, and with the switch to remote and all this COVID thing, we actually had everybody, all the teams on kind of huddles at least 3 times a week. And that was very important for me to kind of realize what staff was working on. And, if that same thing, the same task will be coming up again and again, then that kind of was a red flag for me to kind of follow up with staff and help them with a prioritization. And maybe they needed some more frequent communication, or maybe some help focusing. So that's, I'm going to stop right there, but I wanted to make sure I kind of emphasize or mention a little bit of the lessons learned in terms of management for remote work staff.
Thank you, Johanny. That's a great point, and it's a great suggestion. And I also think it really emphasizes the fact that while technology can facilitate the solution, technology in and of itself, isn't necessarily the solution. And in that case, the huddles, are a management practice that have been very effective.
I'll add, I agree, those are great points. I'll add something that a number of people, thinkers and commentators have said, so it's not a new idea to me, that what this whole experience is doing is sort of accelerating trends that have maybe already been in place. One of them that I think that one of the things that it's sort of surfacing for me, at least, is that you were talking about the benefit of company issued laptops for this, Johan, especially at community IT, but for our clients as well. And I think and with centralized management, of course. I think one of the ways that it benefits is that when you are using, bring your own devices, bring your own laptops or personal computers when you want to work from home on a sort of a time-to-time basis, that seems like that's okay and it works all right, and you get your access to your systems as you need to on your personal computers. But when you're doing it all the time, every day, and it really accelerates whatever else is going on, it really does surface all these risks about data leakage to personal computers. How healthy are those personal computers? And it's just really a much stronger position to be in, to have everybody working on a laptop. And like a community IT, where we have to take security very seriously, because we have a database that has people's passwords in it, and if if that's not, if we don't keep that secure, there's not just our own corporate health is at risk, but our clients as well. So we have like policies that you can't even access, that database unless it's from a company issued device where we have management on it and know that it's protected by antivirus and it's well patched, and that it's being monitored by our advanced tools. So I think that the whole benefit of having company issued equipment is really surfacing. I'm not talking so much about phones because phones do have more hooks for sort of protecting the data that's on them, but definitely for computers. The other thing that I think I want to surface on this slide or talk about here is that I've realized in my own work that when I was at the office, and I worked remotely maybe one or sometimes 2 days a week, but I was at the office a lot as well. When I went to a meeting at the office, I got up from my usual work area and I walked usually into a meeting room and sat down. I might have brought my laptop with me. Usually I did, but I was moving around. I was talking to people. There was a little bit of chit chat before the meeting started, and it kind of broke up the day. Now when I attend meetings, I'm on the same screen that I'm on when I'm working. I don't usually move. I'm just sitting here and all of a sudden I stop looking at my email or looking at the server that I'm looking at, and I just turn my attention to a video chat, and it's just not the same thing anymore. And I think it's creating a need to sort of think. I completely agree with Johanny that the frequent huddles that our teams are having is really beneficial. For one thing, there's a social dynamic there that's really important for workers that might otherwise be isolated. But I think sometimes we have the meetings that we were having at the office had this benefit of sort of breaking up the day and being sort of something different in your workday. And now that they're not, that benefit is gone, and we really need to think about what are the purposes of the meetings that we're having. And I think there's been a lot of efficiency, business practice people, gurus who say, more meetings, shorter meetings, and all that kind of thing. And I think that, and particularly when those meetings are virtual and they're on the screen that you're sitting at anyway, that might be even more true, if that makes sense. I don't know, it's just a thought I had, because I've been noticing that the meetings that I've been having are, by not being in person, just have a different dynamic to them. Although I appreciate the video and I don't want to not have any meetings, I think that there's something going on there.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that's also a great point. And it's a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar, but I do think the nature of work efficiency is changing a little bit. I've noticed that myself, and that my normal routine in a day has changed. And I think in some ways it's become a lot more efficient as a result. So that's an interesting topic, and I think that's important. I think for leaders in an organization to be mindful of what efficiency looks like in a fully remote environment. So I did want to get to a question, great question that came in a few minutes ago, and be sure to use the chat feature if you have any questions for us, and we'll do our best to answer them. So the question is, if staff all have laptops when they're working remotely, don't they also need to have a host computer at the central office which they can connect remotely to the server? And that is no longer necessarily the case. That is, it might be. Now that kind of varies from depending on how the organization is set up. And I think in general, the reference there is to the Windows domain. So you kind of log in to your computer and it authenticates you against Active Directory, which is a list of everybody in the organization that's running on a centralized server. If you're not in the office, chances are you're logging in with cached credentials. That's actually fine, and most of the information systems that you're accessing that are in the cloud don't require you to log in to the server. And one of the things that's changed over the last 5 years or so is the size of the organization that's required to get a server like that continues to go up. So we used to say, well, if you have more than 5 computers, you really need a server, and then it went up to 10, and now it's like somewhere in 20 to 25 range. And also Microsoft is really pushing the envelope on that and making its Azure Active Directory available so that you can just authenticate directly to the cloud. We don't have time to go into that in more detail, but that's kind of the that would be my immediate.
I think the question though also, Johan, is about like not just how you authenticate, but how do you access the resources, and it does, I think the question does sort of reflect the way organizations were all set up, 5-10 years ago, where all of the resources were basically in the office, on premise, we say, running on a server in the office. So if you wanted to access files, you had to somehow get to those files on the server. So either logged into a terminal server or remote desktop server, we sometimes call them, or you had to open up a VPN. And if you wanted to access the Razor's Edge database, you again had to either go to a terminal server or a VPN, because the actual stuff that you needed was in the office. And now so much of that can be at least, and Johan's right, it depends on the IT that the organization has, but it is possible and not even that expensive to move your files to SharePoint or Box or Dropbox, and then you don't need to go connect to an office computer. The point I was making about the laptops was, do you want your staff accessing those SharePoint files that are your files, they're your organization's files? Do you want them accessing them from any old computer, or do you want to say, no, really, we want to make sure that any computers that are accessing the SharePoint files that are in the cloud that need to be managed by us, because we want to have assurance that any computer that connects to our files is healthy and has the latest patches and isn't going to pose a danger to those files by bringing some virus to them. That kind of a thing is I think what I was making the point is. But yes, there are still many of Community IT's clients still have their files on a file server in the office, and have other line of business applications running in the office, but many also don't. And it's been a transition that's happened really suddenly and remarkably just in the last, I would say, 5 years.
Well, that's a good segue to our next slide, which focuses a little bit more on this idea of leveraging the cloud. And so what we wanted to emphasize is that you probably already have a lot of cloud resources. And I think one of the things that a lot of organizations realized in this shift to remote work is they actually had more access to more cloud resources than maybe they realized or certainly were using. So most organizations are going to be in one of two ecosystems, and you're either going to be in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, or you're going to be in the Google ecosystem, G Suite. You might be in both, but chances are you're going to be in one or the other. And if you're in Microsoft 365, you look at all those icons there, you may be familiar with Outlook for email or Word for Word documents, but you may not have been as familiar with the little cloud next to the Outlook, which is for OneDrive, which is kind of like Microsoft's version of Dropbox, where you can store files in a cloud, access them remotely. You may have realized you had access to SharePoint, which is the little S there, but you hadn't been using it. And then certainly Teams, which is the little purple T, is one that a lot of people have gotten more familiar and comfortable with. And we'll have a link in the next, I think, slide after the next one, which sends you to a little bit more information about Teams. Likewise, if you're in the G Suite, you have access to Google Docs. You also have access to Google Meet, which is the little green circle, the quote circle with the video icon. So there are options within your existing cloud suite for leveraging the cloud and working remotely. And then both Microsoft and Google provide some level of integration with third-party providers. And so that, Zoom, I think everyone knows what Zoom is these days. Zoom is the most popular third-party video conferencing option. It can integrate with both Microsoft and Google, and we have another slide talking a little bit more about Zoom in a minute. Slack is a chat feature. So Teams has chat functionality, but there's certain things that Slack does better than Teams. And some organizations have already been using Slack for a while. Dropbox, cloud-based file sharing solution. It works particularly well for smaller organizations. Can also be integrated with both Google and Microsoft. So you may already have more cloud systems at your disposal than you realize, and you know it's worth taking a look at what's available to you. All right, I will. That was my pause for Johanny and Steve if they had anything to add, and I will move on.
You're good.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So talking a little bit about video and chat specifically, because I think this is something that is pretty much mandatory if you're going to work remotely as an organization as a way of staying in touch, staying connected, having access to video meetings, and also having access to real-time chat is pretty important. So as we mentioned, if you already have Microsoft or Google, you have access to that with Teams and Meet. You can use that. We did want to mention that if you're an organization that has significant privacy or security concerns, there are some third-party tools that are available. Signal, I think, is one of the most common. It's a secure end-to-end encrypted messaging app. It's actually built by a foundation in the Bay Area and is an open source solution. Jitsi is an open source video conferencing solution that also, I believe, offers end-to-end encryption. So there's going to be a trade-off. If you need more advanced security, it's going to require more work on your part. And that's really kind of the trade-off between significant security controls over a solution and using something like Teams or Meet, which have security, but you're sort of dependent upon Microsoft and Google to implement that security. And then if you're using Zoom, we got another slide actually with some more best practices about Zoom. So I'm going to save the Zoom comments for that slide. Oh, here it is. All right, so with Zoom, so why would you use Zoom instead of Teams or instead of Google Meet? I think number one, it's very easy to use. It's nowadays an application that most people are familiar and comfortable with, and it's particularly good to use if you're wanting to meet with people outside of your organization. You know, it's possible that everyone in your organization is comfortable now with Teams or Meet, and they're used to using it to talk to each other. But then you go to schedule a meeting with someone outside of the organization, and if they're not familiar with those solutions, it might be difficult for them to use. So Zoom is good because it's kind of got a universal, quality to it. Great for peer-to-peer collaboration. The interface of Zoom itself is pretty strong. Now the downsides of using Zoom are that, at least initially, when everybody's shifted to working remotely, the security, left a little bit to be desired. In some cases, left a lot to be desired. We have an article on our website. I'll chat the link out in a moment if you're interested in learning more about tips for using Zoom securely. They've done things to improve the security of Zoom, but their record on privacy and security is a little bit mixed. They sort of have a reputation of moving quickly and sometimes not paying as much attention to security as they should. That security is sort of an afterthought for them, and that their focus is really on distribution and ease of use. And that's a trade-off. If you want something that's easy to use, that everybody uses, you might end up having to sacrifice some security for that tool. If you're an organization that works on national security issues, I'd strongly recommend taking a very close look at some of the growing security concerns about Zoom. There was an incident just last week where they shut down a Zoom meeting that was occurring with a Chinese dissident located in the United States on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square event. And there's some concerns that Zoom would do that, that they would shut down a meeting that was happening with someone in the United States, seemingly at the request of the Chinese government. So there are some national security concerns with regards to Zoom that I think organizations who are involved in national security issues want to be aware of.
One thing that I recently learned about Zoom is that somebody asked one of our clients about HIPAA compliance, and it was new to me that they have a HIPAA compliance license, which you have to buy a 10 license minimum, and I think it's $200 a month or something like that. But anyway, so that was new to me, and maybe that's kind of their answer to this. Some of the compliance issues that people are raising. I don't know. Have you heard that license, Steve, on the HIPAA? Zoom
I
HIPAA
haven't
compliance?
heard about that. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's new to me.
That's new. Yeah.
I mean, obviously the greatest benefit is I think their technology is the strongest in terms of, you know, the likelihood that you're going to have, you know, stuttering and choppiness. You know, that depends obviously on the quality of the bandwidth of the people that are participating to some extent, but I think Zoom does a better job of using what it has as effectively as it can. And then the fact that it's kind of the standard that all the consumer people are used to. I mean, that people are used to from their non-corporate life, you know, that they use when they talk to their families or whatever. Means that it's the one that you have the least amount of explaining if you're going to do a meeting with people that are outside of your organization, and invite them. If you can invite them to a Zoom meeting, they're more likely to know how to do it, and not have to like figure out how to do it. And those are really significant advantages. But for us, we use Teams primarily internally, and even when we invite our clients to things, and it's, you know, it's partly because we're in the Microsoft ecosystem that Johan mentioned, and it's just convenient to have everything in one place. When I record a meeting that I'm doing in Teams, I don't even have to worry about what happens to that recording. Like, it's automatically, you know, uploaded into the Microsoft cloud, and anybody that's in that team can just access it easily without me doing anything. And those kinds of things are really beneficial. And I'm not as familiar with the Google Meet product, but I would assume that there are similar things going on the Google side of the ecosystem too. So going out to a third party has a little bit of a cost in that regard. But it's so different. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's just, the world is so different than it was 4 months ago when, you know, I remember when you would have a meeting with someone, a video meeting with someone, and you might spend if it was the first time for them, you might spend the first 10 minutes of the meeting just trying to get them to figure out how to turn their camera on or get the audio to work. And now it's just, everyone's gotten through that, and all the jokes that were on Saturday Night Live in March are stale jokes now. You know, people get it, and that's changed everything. You know, now when you get a link to a video conference, you know what to do with it, and it's amazing.
So real quick, any tips on how to be more engaging in using Zoom? I mean, I think that's a question from the audience. I think that's a good point, Steve, that, you know, certain things just got stale. I know in my experience, you know, the backgrounds was a lot of fun at first, you know, like having funny backgrounds. And then that sort of got old. So any tips or latest?
I do think that anybody that it's, you know, it makes a lot of sense for the organization. I mean, unless it's something that you can just get your staff to do, but basically nobody should be using the microphone on their laptops webcam or on their webcam on their desktop's webcam. Like they should have, some other microphone. I prefer like, the over the head a headset, and then it's just sitting there in front of my mouth, and it doesn't look so great on camera, but it's very easy to hear my voice. So yeah, having a good microphone makes a big difference and is worth the investment. Those things, they cost $30, $40 depending on how expensive you get for that. And then, I don't know if you want to make it a policy, but certainly I really appreciate when people do turn their cameras on. There's times when you don't want to have your camera on. And I guess I'm conscious of the fact that we don't have our cameras on right now in this webinar. Maybe we should, but when I'm having meetings with my colleagues, I like to be able to see them. And when I'm talking to clients, I appreciate being able to see them. So those are two things to keep in mind.
Don't give Johan new ideas for the webinar, Steve.
And I know that, the other thing I did mention how Zoom probably does the best job of like making the best use of bandwidth when it's not plentiful or when it's inconsistent. And I know that some of our colleagues at Community IT, live in places where their internet isn't super duper consistent, and that's just a challenge. And that's a place where you do turn off your video, because the video, of course, does require extra bandwidth. So sometimes you sacrifice that in order to make the audio as good as it can be.
Yep. All right. Well, let's move on to talk a little bit about cybersecurity. This slide detailing the overall cybersecurity landscape is actually, was valid before the pandemic and before remote working, but I think all of these challenges are even more pronounced now. So the four main challenges that we've seen with regards to cybersecurity are persistent and ongoing brute force attacks on identities, and that just means, if your accounts are all out in the cloud, hackers are trying to identify, your credentials to hack into your cloud-based systems on an ongoing basis. So that's happening a lot, something to be aware of. Spear phishing has become a lot more sophisticated, and I think especially early on, the end of March and early April, there was, we saw an uptick in sort of spear phishing attacks that were leveraging things related to COVID. Emails that had COVID in the subject line or in the body were getting people's attention, and so it became easier to kind of break through as a spear phisher. So that was something to look out for. Organizations that have enemies because of the nature of the work that they do are targeted and are continuing to be targeted now. And there are also attacks targeting your vendors. So that's another thing to look out for. And the now classic example of that is the hack on Target. Sorry, this is bad pun or bad coincidence of verbiage, but Target, the retailer, they had that famous attack, back in 2013, I think, 2012, and famously, the hack came through their HVAC vendor. So they basically had access to all of Target's information systems. Their HVAC vendor did, and the hackers hacked into the HVAC vendor because, what do they care? Who's going to hack them? They just do HVAC work. Well, they got to the HVAC vendor and then used that to get to the to Target's systems and ended up stealing all of the credit card information. So, you got to look out for your vendors. Some of the specific security risks related to working remotely. So, single factor authentication, this is something that we've been preaching constantly and will continue to do so. Using single factor, just a username and password to access information is just nowadays inherently very risky. And wherever possible, we encourage using multi-factor. This is particularly true with remote desktop servers. So this kind of goes back to that challenge that people have with, line of business applications that they may be running from their office. They've now opened those up either through VPN or a remote desktop server. That's risky because it's single factor, and the brute force attacks could eventually determine what the factor is. So that's one security risk. Work devices being used by families. Matt has our chief technology officer had a great example that escapes me now, but this is from a Fortune 500 company who, some executive allowed his son to use his laptop and ended up, getting hacked because of the son was not doing, was going to gaming websites or hacker websites or whatever the case may be. So it's tough. It's really hard right now because kids need computers throughout the day, or at least they did when school was in session. They might need them now for virtual summer camps. Everything is now being done virtually and on computers. So family members using work computers is, there's an increased likelihood that that's going to happen. But it might be worth, giving your staff a heads up that if that they shouldn't be doing it, but if they do, to monitor or chaperone the usage of that computer. On the flip side, people using their personal devices for work, particularly home computers that are out of your control, so it's not clear, how secured they are. Are they free from viruses? Are they free from hackers? People using their home computers to access work information introduces new risks. I'd mentioned the targeted phishing, and the apps like Zoom, which introduce their own security risks. So I'll be quiet now. Johanny, Steve, what have you seen in terms of new security risks that come from this remote working?
I think on the home use, I think now is when and you mentioned Matt, and so staff education came to mind with the security awareness training. That I think will kind of come a long way, educating your users on kind of accessing company data from home, especially. So things like is your wireless network at home secure? I think that's something that it probably used to be an afterthought before this thing, but that's something to emphasize, and that's something that things like security awareness trainings of all cases kind of will educate users on that. I think going to a cafe, which now these days, I guess, since they are starting to reopen, that's something to also keep in mind. Like those are Wi-Fi on the cafes are open, and a potential risk when you kind of access company data from there too.
I'll just add that it's not particularly, I don't know if it's particularly associated with the pandemic and having to work from home at all, though it may be, but I'm continuing to be struck by just the never ceasing increase in attempts made to compromise accounts and IT systems. And I think it was reasonable at one time to be like, well, you sort of have this safety in numbers that there's lions out there, but you're in a herd of 1,000 wildebeest or whatever, and what are the chances? It just doesn't seem very likely. But your terminal server, if it's not secured properly, is being attacked right now, today. I can virtually guarantee it. And if you have an Office 365 account, if you've ever used that account for any other service, like you signed up for Netflix and you used your work email address, and I shouldn't say Netflix because I don't think Netflix has ever been hacked, but you used it in Target and Target got hacked. That password has been tried to see if that same password will work to open up your Office 365 mailbox. Like, that has been tried already. You can almost guarantee it. Like, there's just so much stuff happening like that, that it's a scary world and this stuff needs to be taken extremely seriously.
So what are some things that you can do to take it seriously? And we have alluded to some of those already. Updating your computers is very important if you have an RMM, or remote monitoring and management system, or a device management system in place. Just double check on it, make sure that it's working and that it's applying updates to the computers. If you don't, it'd probably be a good idea to reach out to your staff and recommend that they update their computers, particularly if they're using their personal computers. We recommend rebooting weekly, at least. You know, that that doesn't always happen. You know, people just they use their computer and then they put it to sleep, or they hibernate it when they're done at the end of the day, and the updates will never get applied if the computer isn't rebooted. So it's important to just reboot. Make sure that the data is backed up. This helps you recover from attacks, or like crypto wall type attacks. So it's important to have good data backup in place. Particularly true now, as people are working from home and might be saving important files and information to their desktops, their local machines. We mentioned multi-factor authentication already. Strongly encourage using a password manager to manage passwords, so that your staff aren't using simple passwords or putting them on a sticky note that their children will grab and I don't do who knows what with. So password managers are really useful tools, as Johanny mentioned. Train your staff. Security awareness, I think now especially, is a great time to draw people's attentions to the risks that they face through cybersecurity, and wherever possible, use systems that are provided by the organization. All right. So let's. Oh yeah, go ahead, Johnny.
No. I think you have another maybe as part of your next section, IT policies. But I just wanted to also say, in terms of updating your computers, to have some sort of IT policy where you state kind of the minimum requirements for personal use devices. So if I have an old computer, laptop that I'm using, and still have Windows XP, Windows 7, those computers that operating system is no longer supported and patched by Microsoft. So that's a potential security risk that you want to also kind of educate your users, in terms of using the up-to-date operating system, and laying that out on your policy as well as a minimum requirement.
Yeah, definitely. So in the last few minutes here, we just want to talk about moving back into the office. And I think certainly, and here we're just going to share our own experience, and then also what we see happening in the nonprofit sector based on the conversations we've been having with our clients and with other nonprofit organizations. I think right now there's a general sense that most organizations are either going to stay fully remote, or they're going to move into some sort of hybrid approach where they're still going to have a significant number of staff working remotely for a significant amount of time. And so being able to support remote work has become a priority, and is something that all organizations are going to need to be able to do moving forward. We've also started to think about our own office and reimagine what the office space is. Is it a place where we all come to do work, or do we do most of our work from home now, and then the office is just there as an equipment depot where we can drop off and pick up equipment, as a place where if we need to have some in-person meetings, we can do that. We have, copier facilities there that can be used if necessary. So, we've started to talk about what our office might mean to us over the next year to 3 years, and it probably will be used differently than we've used it traditionally. And I think a lot of organizations are starting to think about it in that way. As you start to think about your plans for returning to your office in this new way, some of the things that are important to keep in mind is this process of reintegrating. The switch to remote work happened very suddenly, and I think there was a premium on we just got to find a way to make it work. Now that we've been doing that for 3 months and we have a little bit more time to plan our return to the office, what are things that we can do to effectively reintegrate? So in terms of data, make sure you have your systems of record, rein in data sprawl. People may have been storing all their information locally. They may have gone out and found their own information systems just out of necessity. How can you move all of that information from all these different individual systems back to an organizational system? So that's something to start thinking about. You should do that regardless of whether or not you're going back to a physical office. But now is a good time to start getting an evaluation of where all your data is. And then if there are new systems, I mean, one of the great things that's happened over the last 3 months is all the experimentation and the improvisation and adaptation to this new working environment. You may have teams that, actual teams, not Microsoft Teams, but like groups, departments in your organization that have found a new way of working. Well, don't let that be shadow IT forever. How can that IT system be brought into the official set of IT systems that the organization is using? And then you want to reintegrate your devices. So make sure before, particularly if you have a large in-house network, you have a lot of staff coming back, before in the same way that you're maybe having your staff take their temperature before they come to the office, make sure that their systems are up to date with patches. The last thing you want is an unpatched, compromised system coming back within the firewall of your office and bringing a data breach in-house. So make sure that your systems are up to date, that they're fully patched. Make sure that they're clean, that they're virus-free, that they haven't been compromised. If you've added any controls related to shared use, you want to update those. You should probably have people update their credentials and also your local administrator credentials on those machines. And then finally, your policy. So, you may not have realized it, but 2020 was going to be a year where your business continuity plan was put to the test. Well, now you can look back and say, well, we didn't have one. Well, you've got a lot of experience now to be able to write one. And if you did have one, now's a great time to go back and review it and see what worked. Same thing with your IT policy. Chances are, my guess is that 90 to 95% of organizations out there did not include pandemic response on their IT policy or full remote work on their IT policy. So now's a great time. You've got that experience under your belt to add that to your IT policy. And as you start to think about IT planning for your next fiscal year, all of the experiences that we've had can help inform your future planning. So moving to a more mobile workforce, investing in tools to do that central management we had talked about earlier, and finding ways to continue leveraging the cloud. All right, wow. I warned Steve and Johanny that I'm terrible at managing time and we're gonna have to rush the slides at the end. And I said, this time I'm not gonna do that, but here we are, rushing through the slides at the end. We are gonna stay on even though the webinar officially concludes at 4. We'll stay on for any questions. And I definitely want to give Steve and Johanny some additional time to share their thoughts on reintegrating into a new office environment. So if you can stay after 4, please do. But before we move on to Q&A, just wanted to remind everybody that we're going to have a webinar in July. It's going to be July 15th from 3 to 4 o'clock. And we're going to be talking about a framework for nonprofit cybersecurity risk assessment. So we're going to look at the NIST framework and help you apply that to assessing your own cybersecurity risk. All right, so before we get to the Q&A, Steve, Johanny, anything to add in that last section there?
I think you covered it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't have anything that came to mind as you were going through that.
Yeah, I think you cover a lot of the stuff. I think one thing that came to mind as you were talking, Johan, was that I read somewhere that one of the the things that if you have an IT tech or IT department, one of the things that they were gonna have to do is kind of grab all of those computers that home computers to kind of digital sanitize them and do the stuff that you are talking about in terms of patching the computers, moving the data, or at least providing some sort of guidance to the users to move the local data to SharePoint if they have the files in the cloud or the file server. But digital sanitizer equipment is something that I have read in many articles that it's going to be kind of the responsibility of the IT team to make sure that happens as we reintegrate back to the office.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we do have a few questions. So let's get to those. What do you recommend in terms of protection from ad pop-ups? If someone's been using their company laptop for for whatever use, but they've been online, they've been browsing, and they have ad pop-ups. Any suggestions there?
I admit that's something that I haven't dealt with for a while. I think so. I don't have a recommendation. I'm sorry. I know that the Chrome browser has some plugins that help with that, but
yeah, that's what I was gonna say too.
It's a great question. Yeah, I don't get a lot of ads except when I'm like, I do, try to figure out sometimes on my work computer personal questions like what movie I should try to pitch to my family to watch on a Friday night, and then I'm Googling movie names, and then I suddenly start seeing ads. But when I'm doing my work, for whatever reason, IT sites don't pop up tons of ads at me, it doesn't seem like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we've seen a decline in the sort of persistent ads that are constantly popping up even after you've stopped visiting the site. But certainly I think some of the general recommendations that we've made around keeping the computers patched and up to date certainly help with that, and making sure the browser is up to date. I think that's another key one. I know that Chrome now, and certainly Safari for a while, have put a lot of ad blocking software. They've kind of built it into their browsers.
Maybe clearing out the browser cache and everything like that might be beneficial in that regard too.
Yeah.
Clearing out all the cookies and stuff.
Do we suggest changing passwords once we go back to the office? What's your recommendation on that?
What we really keep coming back to is that to just get them, get a decent password and then put multi-factor authentication on it, and way more. That's way more effective than even changing passwords. In fact, I was actually logging into the admin portal of an Office 365 tenant of a client this morning, I think, and noticed that there was a recommendation from Microsoft saying, you can just turn off the changing your password requirement. That Microsoft is saying it's actually more effective not to require people to change their passwords, because what they do when you ask them to change their passwords is they just end up choosing bad passwords or writing them down. There's different bad behaviors happen when you keep asking people to change their password. But of course, that advice is predicated on having multi-factor authentication, because that basically, the multi-factor part is what gives you the additional layer of protection that that changing the password frequently would have done otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of sidestepped the question. I don't think it's a problem to have people change their passwords when they get back to the office, but I think if you're doing that and thinking that's what's going to help me, not multi-factor, then I think you're missing the advice, which is to implement multi-factor.
Well, and I think it's important. Typically, it's good to think of security issues within the larger context. So, if your staff have been using their home computers to log into check their email, then it might be a good precaution to have them change their passwords. But as Steve, you mentioned, that provides a little bit more protection. But what really helps is implementing multi-factor. So I think it's if they've had their laptops at home, their work issued laptops, and they've generally just been using those for work, then and you have multi-factor in place, then you probably don't need to worry about changing passwords at all. So there's kind of a range, there's sort of a continuum of scenarios to think about that sort of depend on your specific situation. What type of risks are involved in moving all company records onto a cloud-based system? Are there risks to be considered? I'd be happy to take a stab at this. It really depends. The consultant's canard, right? It depends on the nature of the records. I think generally, if you're talking about, typical files that, that don't have privacy regulations associated with them, then the risk is generally pretty low. And in some ways, it's probably less risky to put those files in a cloud-based system where they're being backed up than it is to have them on someone's local machine. Once you start to get into files that are regulated in some way, then it's really important that you you include that consideration as part of your evaluation of a cloud-based system. So I think, for example, one of the ones that we deal with regularly is HIPAA, and personally identifiable information, particularly medical information, is very tightly regulated, and you're generally in those situations wanting to use a system that is designed to protect that information and that is built to be HIPAA compliant. And that you want to be very clear with staff that they should not be storing any of that information in files that aren't encrypted and that are just being stored, in SharePoint or in OneDrive, or in email for that matter. So I think it's the nature of the file. So legal files, if there's regulated information, you want to make sure that it's being stored in a system that is compliant with whatever regulations might be involved. If it's unregulated information, if it's just information that has some sensitivity to the organization, then I think at that point you need to sort of evaluate the level of risk associated with the information getting out. So, if we have information, some of which is incredibly confidential, and if it were to get out, would be incredibly damaging, and so that information is not stored in OneDrive, or SharePoint. It's stored in a very secure system. We have other information that's somewhat confidential, but not as risky, and that's in a system that's a little bit easier to access. And then, for example, like proposals, we send out sales proposals to potential customers. It's a little bit confidential in the sense that, we have a little blurb about them, and we include our pricing, which we don't want to just make publicly available. But in general, if that information were to get compromised, the impact would be relatively low. So in those cases, having it in SharePoint, which is secured in a variety of ways, using multi-factor authentication, et cetera, we feel pretty comfortable with that system. So that's my longer version of it depends. I think to really answer your question, I think it's great that you're asking the question, and it's important to think about all of your information from a security perspective and not just say, well, we're going to move it all out into the cloud. I do think that a lot of organizations get nervous about putting information in the cloud because they feel like, well, it's going to be more at risk of being compromised. I think the reality is that files that are being stored on a staff person's local machine or on a local server are probably at as much or more risk as files that are being stored in a secure cloud location like SharePoint or Dropbox.
I don't disagree with that, but I will add some nuance, perhaps. Like you were describing SharePoint as like this, like the place you might put the stuff that you're less concerned about. SharePoint itself is a very secure system, but out of the box, it doesn't have a lot of the controls on it that can be added to it that would make, SharePoint itself is designed for HIPAA compliant use and can be used in a HIPAA compliant way because of that. Like it is encrypted in transit, all the things that are required, but out of the box, just normally it may not have all of the controls on it that you'd want for HIPAA compliant data. And you can add those controls, but it might be easier to, if you're dealing with legal records, to use a system designed for legal records, because those have those controls sort of built and purpose-built right from the get-go. Someone else has done that work for you rather than using a general purpose system like SharePoint and then trying to build it yourself. The other thing I would say is that one of the benefits in terms of security of having things on an on-premise server is that by and large, you have to be on-premise to access those records. Now, as soon as you add a VPN or a RDP access, you've given up that security. And of course, your on-premise server is probably, if you're talking about, like you're one of those organizations Johan mentioned that works on national security issues, a state actor wants to get to your server on-premise, they can probably get into your office because it's, not that difficult probably to gain access to most of our offices unless we happen to work in like, a Department of Defense facility or something which has, armed guards and all that kind of a thing. But normally when it's on premise, you think of it as being, you can't just access it. When it's in the cloud, you can probably pretty much access it from anywhere. And so you have to think more about data leakage. I don't think in terms of security, if you have it protected by multi-factor authentication and the systems are used properly, it's already pretty good. I think there's a lot more insecurity in the old systems where I think of the users as clients, where a staff person needs this file at home to work on it at home. So they email it to themselves, and the email itself is not necessarily a secure method of getting a file. They go to their home computer, they log into their email, they download it to their personal computer, and they're working away on it. And you might as well be in the cloud at that point. You didn't get a lot from staying on premise. If that's sort of a story to illustrate the risks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. All right. Well, I think we've reached the end of the questions. Any final thoughts, Johanny or Steve?
No, I think, we covered a lot, and it's good. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you both for joining. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. And we certainly wish you all the best and hope that you continue to be safe. And we will see you next month. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.